The baby's tiny fingers closed around the crimson, silk tie like it was the only solid thing in the universe. Stanton Vance, the man Wall Street called the Ice King, the CEO whose cold stare had ended careers and cratered stock prices, stood frozen in the middle of his own corner office, a phone in one hand and security on speed dial. His jaw was locked so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. His nostrils flared with each controlled breath. And yet he didn't move. He couldn't move. Because a small, silent, impossibly calm baby girl barely a year old, had lunged forward from her carrier on the marble floor and grabbed hold of him like he was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. The mother, a black woman in a faded blue cleaning uniform, stood 3 feet away. Her name tag read Renee. Her hands were frozen mid-reach, her dark eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with losing her job and everything to do with what this man might do next. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, 52 floors below, Manhattan slept. But here, in this glass and steel cathedral of power, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Stanton Vance had fired executives for less. He had ended partnerships over a crooked signature. He had looked into the eyes of desperate men begging for one more chance and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of efficiency. And now, a baby girl with wide brown eyes and soft curls was wrinkling his $3,000 Hermes tie in her tiny fist, staring up at him with an expression that looked almost like recognition. Like she'd been looking for him her whole short life. How does a man who spent 30 years building walls around his heart react when a baby, a complete stranger's child, reaches for him like he's the safest place in the world? What could possibly make the Ice King lower that phone? If you want to see what happens next, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to crack wide open, and you don't want to miss a single moment. But to understand how Stanton Vance ended up in this impossible moment, we need to go back to earlier that night when the world still made sense, when the Ice King was still frozen solid, when a desperate mother made a choice that would change everything. The executive floor of Vance Towers was a monument to controlled perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their light dancing across floors of Italian Carrara marble so polished you could see your reflection in them. The air smelled of leather and money, the kind of old, quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Every surface gleamed. Every corner was precise. Every inch of the 52nd floor whispered one message: power lives here. At 11:47 p.m., the floor was empty save for the security guards in the lobby and the overnight cleaning crew working their way through the building. Most people who worked at Vance Capital had long since gone home to their families, their dinners, their lives. Stanton Vance had no such life. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city lights glitter like scattered diamonds far below. The merger documents sat on his desk behind him, 300 pages that represented 18 months of negotiations, $4 billion in assets, and the complete acquisition of his largest competitor. Tomorrow he would sign them. Tomorrow he would add another victory to a career built on victories. Tomorrow the financial world would once again bow to the Ice King. But tonight something gnawed at him, a restlessness he couldn't name, an itch beneath his skin that no amount of success could scratch. He was 61 years old. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He owned homes on 3 continents, a private jet, a yacht that slept 12. He had shaped industries, crushed rivals, and built an empire from nothing but ambition and ice-cold discipline. And yet, standing here in the dark, Stanton Vance felt the weight of his solitude like a physical thing pressing down on his chest. He loosened his tie, the crimson one, his favorite, the one he wore for closings and conquests, and turned from the window. He needed to walk. He needed to move. He needed to escape the silence of his own thoughts. The hallways of the executive floor stretched before him like the corridors of a museum after hours. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble with military precision. He passed the boardroom where he'd ended careers with a single sentence. He passed the conference room where grown men had wept, begging for second chances he never gave. Emotion is weakness, he reminded himself. Sentiment is the enemy of success. These were the mantras that had built his empire. These were the principles that had made him a legend. These were the lies he told himself to keep from falling apart. He rounded the corner toward the executive lounge and stopped. Light spilled from beneath his private office door. His jaw tightened. No one was supposed to be in there. Not the cleaning crew, not the security team, not anyone. His office was off limits, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, protected by keycard access and explicit instructions that had never once been violated. Until now. He pushed the door open without knocking. The scene that greeted him was so unexpected, so utterly incongruous with everything his life represented, that for a moment he simply stood there, processing. A woman knelt on the floor beside his mahogany desk, a spray bottle in one hand and a rag in the other. She wore the blue uniform of the overnight cleaning staff, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was perhaps 30, with high cheekbones and eyes that held a weariness far beyond her years. But that wasn't what made Stanton's blood turn to ice. Beside her, tucked into the corner like a secret, was a baby carrier. And in that carrier, bundled in a soft pink blanket, was a baby girl with wide brown eyes and tiny hands that seemed to be reaching for the overhead lights. The woman's head snapped up. Recognition flooded her face, not of him as a person, but of him as a threat. She scrambled to her feet, the spray bottle slipping from her fingers and clattering against the marble. "Mr. Vance, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were," the schedule said. "What?" Stanton said, his voice flat and metallic like a gavel striking stone. "Is that doing in my building?" He didn't point. He didn't need to. His eyes, cold as Arctic ice, locked onto the baby carrier with the precision of a targeting system. The woman, Renee, according to her name tag, positioned herself between him and the carrier, not aggressively, not defiantly, just protectively, the way a mother stands when she knows she's outmatched but refuses to surrender. "Sir, I can explain. This is a place of business." His voice didn't rise. That was what made it terrifying. Not a daycare, not a shelter, not a— he paused, searching for the word that would convey the full depth of his disgust— nursery. "I know, sir, I know. My sitter, she canceled last minute. She just didn't show up. And I couldn't miss this shift. I'm already behind on—" She stopped herself, swallowed. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "It won't happen again." Stanton reached for the phone on his desk. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, the way an executioner reaches for the axe. "Security will escort you out. Your final paycheck will be mailed." "Please." The word escaped her before she could stop it, but she didn't beg. She didn't fall to her knees. She simply stood there, shoulders back, chin lifted, dignity intact even as her world crumbled. "Please, I'm one shift away from—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together, shook her head. "I'll go," she said quietly. "Just let me get my daughter." She turned toward the carrier and bent to lift it. And that's when it happened. Stanton's finger was on the speed dial. His mind was already moving on to the merger, to the morning, to the 1,000 details that demanded his attention. The cleaning woman and her baby would be a footnote, forgotten by sunrise. But the baby had other plans. In the moment between one heartbeat and the next, the little girl, Layla, though Stanton didn't know her name yet, did something she hadn't done in months, something her mother had begun to fear she might never do again. She reached. Not for her mother, not for the blanket, not for the familiar safety of the carrier. She reached for him. Her tiny body lurched forward with surprising strength. her small hand stretching toward the tall, cold man in the expensive suit. And before Stanton could react, before he could step back or turn away, her fingers closed around his crimson silk tie and held on. The fabric bunched and wrinkled in her grip. The knot, so precisely tied that morning, pulled askew. The tie that had survived 100 boardroom battles, that had witnessed the rise and fall of fortunes, was now being crushed in the fist of a child who couldn't even walk yet. Stanton stood paralyzed. The phone was still in his hand. Security was one button away. Everything about his life, his training, his carefully constructed identity screamed at him to disengage, to call for help, to rid himself of this complication. But he couldn't move. The baby's eyes, those enormous, bottomless brown eyes, stared up at him with an expression that was utterly impossible to read. She wasn't crying. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't making a sound. She was just holding on. Like he was the only solid thing in her universe. Renee's face had gone pale. She stood frozen, one hand still extended toward the carrier, watching the scene unfold with barely concealed terror. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. She doesn't." And then she stopped. Something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like wonder. "She doesn't do that," Renee finished softly. She hasn't reached for anyone, not since her father died." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Stanton's gaze shifted from the baby to the mother. His voice, when he spoke, had lost some of its metallic edge. "What?" Renee swallowed. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to tell painful truths without breaking. "My husband was killed 7 months ago. Hit-and-run driver, they never found him." She paused, steadying herself. "Marcus was. He was everything to us, and Layla was there. In the car seat, she saw the whole thing." Stanton felt something cold slither down his spine. He looked down at the baby, this tiny, silent, watchful creature who was still gripping his tie like it was a lifeline. "The doctors said it was trauma," Renee continued. "They said she retreated into herself. She stopped crying. She stopped reaching. She wouldn't let anyone hold her, not my mother, not the nurses, not anyone. They said it might be years before she," her voice cracked just barely, "before she felt safe enough to connect again." The office was so quiet Stanton could hear his own heartbeat. "I'm sorry," Renee said again, softer now. "She only does that when she feels safe." The words hit Stanton like a physical blow. Safe. This baby, this traumatized, orphaned, silent baby, had looked at him, the Ice King, the man who had built his entire life on being unapproachable, and somehow, inexplicably, decided that he was safe. And in that moment, looking down at those tiny fingers wrapped around his crumpled tie, Stanton Vance felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt the ice crack. "So here's my question for you. If you were Stanton Vance right now, standing there with a baby holding onto you like you're her last hope, a baby who hasn't trusted anyone since watching her father die, what would you do? Would you call security and protect your empire? Or would you let yourself be human for the first time in 30 years? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know where you stand, because what happens next might surprise you." The phone was still in Stanton's hand. His thumb hovered over the button. One press and this would all be over. The cleaning woman would be escorted out. The baby would be taken away. And he could return to his merger, his empire, his perfectly controlled existence. But his hand wouldn't move. Because looking at that tiny fist clutching his tie, watching the way the expensive crimson silk bunched between those impossibly small fingers, he wasn't seeing a stranger's child anymore. He was seeing his own daughter. Emily. She would be 34 now. A woman grown, with a life he knew nothing about. He hadn't spoken to her in 11 years. Not since the divorce, not since his wife had finally stopped making excuses for his absences and walked away, taking their daughter with her. He could still remember the last time he'd seen Emily. She'd been 23, standing in the doorway of his old apartment, her eyes filled with a hurt that had calcified into something harder. "I waited for you, Dad," she'd said. "Every school play, every graduation, every time I needed you, and you never came." He tried to explain the deals, the demands, the empire he was building for her future. But even as the words left his mouth, he'd known they were hollow. He'd known he was lying, not to her but to himself. "You know what the worst part is," Emily had continued, her voice steady even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I still wanted you to. Every single time I thought maybe this would be the one. Maybe this time he'll show up." She'd shaken her head, and in that moment, he'd watched something die in her eyes. "Goodbye, Dad." He hadn't followed her, hadn't called, hadn't fought. He'd told himself it was better this way, cleaner, more efficient. He'd told himself she would understand someday when she had her own company, her own success. But standing here now, 30 years of regret pressing down on his chest like a stone, he finally understood the truth he'd spent his whole life running from. He hadn't built an empire. He'd built a prison. And he was the only one locked inside. The baby cooed softly. Her grip on his tie didn't loosen. Stanton looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that shattered the last of his defenses. He saw trust. Pure, unearned, impossible trust. This child, who had every reason to be afraid of the world, who had watched her father die and retreated into silence, had looked at him and decided he was worth reaching for. Slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through water, Stanton lowered the phone. He set it on the desk behind him. The click of plastic against mahogany seemed impossibly loud in the silent office. Renee watched him, barely breathing. Stanton looked at her, then back at the baby. Then, with a care that seemed utterly foreign to his hands, he extended one finger toward the child. Layla released the tie and wrapped her entire hand around his finger instead. Something hot and terrible burned behind Stanton's eyes. His throat tightened. His perfectly constructed mask, the mask he'd worn for 30 years, the mask that had made him billions and cost him everything, began to slip. He didn't cry. The Ice King didn't cry. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Stanton Vance felt. "Sit down," he said to Renee. His voice had changed. The metallic edge was gone. What remained was something rougher, rougher, the voice of a man who had just discovered he still had a heart. Renee hesitated. "Sir." "Please." The word felt unfamiliar in his mouth. When was the last time he'd said please to anyone? "Sit down, tell me about her, tell me about everything." They talked until the sky outside began to lighten. Renee told him about Marcus, about how they'd met in college, how he'd proposed at a park with a ring he'd saved for 2 years to buy, how they'd dreamed of opening a small clinic together someday. She'd been in nursing school when he died. She'd had to drop out to take care of Layla. She told him about the graveyard shifts, how she'd taken the overnight cleaning job because it was the only one that let her be home during the day, about the childcare that ate up half her paycheck, about the sitter who'd promised to come tonight and simply hadn't. "I know it was wrong to bring her here," Renee said quietly, "but I was one shift away from eviction, one shift, and I couldn't let her become homeless because I followed the rules." Stanton said nothing, but he listened, really listened in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. And as the first rays of dawn painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and rose, Stanton Vance made a decision that would change everything. 1 week later, Renee Williams walked into Vance Towers through the front entrance. She wasn't carrying a mop or wearing a blue uniform. She was dressed in professional clothes, clothes she'd bought with the advance she'd been given, and holding a folder full of paperwork. The security guard at the front desk smiled at her. "Ms. Williams, they're expecting you on the 48th floor, the HR department." The job offer had come 3 days after that night. Not a cleaning position, a role in the company's new employee wellness initiative. The work was meaningful, the hours were flexible, and the pay was enough to cover childcare, rent, and something Renee had almost given up on: the nursing program at Columbia. Vance Capital would cover her tuition, all of it. A private grant, the letter had said, established specifically for employees seeking to complete their education. Renee had cried when she read it. Not the quiet tears she'd learned to hide, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who had been holding on by their fingernails for too long. For the first time since Marcus died, she felt like she could breathe. 3 weeks after that, something else changed. The employees of Vance Capital began to notice that Stanton Vance was leaving early. Not by much, 5 o'clock instead of 9. But for a man who had famously worked 18-hour days for 3 decades, it was seismic. Rumors spread. Was he sick? Was the company in trouble? Was the Ice King finally melting? No one knew the truth. No one knew about the phone calls he'd started making, late at night, to a number he'd memorized but never dialed. No one knew about the voicemails he left, one after another, saying things he should have said 11 years ago. "Emily, I know you might not want to hear from me. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm calling anyway, because I finally understand what I should have understood a long time ago. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And if you ever want to talk, just talk, I'll be here." She didn't call back, not the first week, not the second. But on the third week, his phone buzzed with a text message. "I got your messages. I'm not ready to talk, but I'm not saying never. Give me time." Stanton read those words 17 times. And for the first time in 30 years, the Ice King smiled. 6 months later, a small change appeared in Stanton Vance's corner office. The merger documents were gone, filed away with all the other victories. The crystal awards and stock certificates still lined the shelves. The view of Manhattan was just as spectacular. But on his desk, right next to his computer in a simple silver frame, was a photograph. It showed a tiny hand, fingers curled around crumpled crimson silk. The tie was still wrinkled, still imperfect, still the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned. Beneath the photo, in his own handwriting, was a single sentence: "True power isn't shown by how many people obey you, but by who feels safe reaching for you." He looked at that photo every morning, every evening, every time the old habits tried to creep back, every time the ice threatened to reform around his heart. And every time, he remembered the night that changed everything. The night a desperate mother broke the rules to save her daughter. The night a traumatized baby reached for a stranger. The night the Ice King finally melted. Renee graduated from Columbia 18 months later, top of her nursing class. Stanton was in the audience, not in the front row, not making a scene, just a tall figure in the back with suspiciously bright eyes. Layla, now nearly 3, sat on her grandmother's lap in the front row, clapping her tiny hands and calling out "Mama" when Renee crossed the stage. The little girl who had once been silent now laughed constantly. She reached for everyone, hugging strangers, waving at dogs, treating the world like it was full of friends she simply hadn't met yet. And whenever she saw the tall man in the nice suits, the one who sometimes came to her birthday parties, who always brought the best presents, who looked at her like she was the most important thing in the world, she would run straight into his arms. "Stan," she would shriek, "Stan, Stan, Stan." He tried to get her to call him Mr. Vance, then Stanton, then Uncle Stanton. But she just laughed and called him Stan, and somehow, impossibly, that was perfect. On the night before Renee's first day at her new position, a nursing coordinator at a major Manhattan hospital, Stanton met her for coffee. It had become their ritual. Once a month, always the same cafe, always the same table by the window. "I don't know how to thank you," Renee said. "You changed our lives, you gave us everything." Stanton shook his head. His eyes, once cold as Arctic ice, now held something warmer. "No," he said quietly. "Layla gave me something I didn't even know I'd lost. She reminded me that I was still human, that it wasn't too late." He paused. "She saved me, Renee, not the other way around." Renee smiled. "She has that effect on people." "She's remarkable." Stanton looked out the window at the city lights, just like her mother. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Emily called me yesterday," Stanton said finally. "She's coming to visit next month, first time in 11 years. Renee's eyes widened. "Stanton, that's wonderful." "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix what I broke." "You don't fix it," Renee said gently. "You just show up. You just keep showing up even when it's hard, even when it hurts. That's all any of us can do." Stanton nodded slowly. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned it from watching a billionaire let a baby hold his finger," she said. "Turns out, the bravest thing anyone can do is let themselves be reached." The Ice King was never the same after that night in his corner office. Oh, he still ran his company with precision. He still closed deals and crushed competitors and built his empire ever higher. But something fundamental had shifted. He started leaving at 5. He started asking his employees about their families. He started a childcare initiative that made Vance Capital the most family-friendly company on Wall Street. And every year on the anniversary of that night, he would find the crumpled crimson tie in his desk drawer, still wrinkled, still imperfect, and hold it for a moment. Remembering the night, a desperate mother taught him about courage. Remembering the night, a silent baby taught him about trust. Remembering the night, he finally understood that true power has nothing to do with empires, and everything to do with the people brave enough to reach for you. And everything to do with being brave enough to reach back. Stanton Vance spent 30 years building walls, only to discover that the smallest hands could break them down. This story reminds us that our greatest strength isn't measured by the power we hold over others, but by the safety we offer to those who have no power at all. If you found wisdom in tonight's story, I think you'll want to hear what's coming next. A homeless veteran returns the wallet of the CEO who once fired him, and what happens when their paths cross again will leave you speechless. Subscribe now with notifications on so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.